Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Brian. When I told the woman I was months away from marrying, not to travel with her male best friend, she defied my request, and I did the one thing she never expected me to do. This all started with what seemed like an exciting romance. I met Margaret during my last year of business school. She was getting her degree in social work, really passionate about helping people. That magnetic energy drew everyone to her. We met at a coffee shop on campus, where she was working on her laptop. I'd seen her around before and always thought she seemed focused and confident, but I'd never had the courage to talk to her. That day, I decided to make my move. When I approached her, she looked up and asked if I needed help. I decided to pose like I needed help on a made-up question. She answered my made-up question, and what started as study help turned into a 3-hour conversation about everything. By the time I left that coffee shop, I knew I wanted to see her again. We started dating over the next few months, during school and social activities together. Margaret was different from anyone I'd ever been with. She was smart and caring, ambitious and thoughtful, which made her friends with people. After we graduated, we both got jobs in the same city, which felt like a sign we were meant to be together. We moved in together after about a year of dating. The first couple years were mostly good, even though we had our differences. But there were things that bothered me that I tried to ignore. Margaret had this habit of making me feel guilty whenever I wanted to spend time with my own friends without her. She'd never directly say I couldn't go, but she'd get quiet and moody, or suddenly have some crisis that needed my attention right when I was supposed to meet up with people. She also had this way of turning every disagreement into me being the problem. If I brought up something about our relationship that bothered me, she'd somehow flip around to make me feel like I was being too sensitive or unreasonable. I started second-guessing myself a lot, wondering if my concerns were valid or if I was just being difficult. The good times were really good, which made the bad times feel like maybe they weren't that big a deal. Margaret had a close group of friends from college, including a guy friend, Trevor, who had been in her life since freshman year. Trevor studied architecture in college and now worked for a company that designed eco-friendly buildings. They'd stayed close after graduation, talking regularly, which I wasn't always a fan of. From the beginning, something about Trevor made me uncomfortable, and it wasn't just normal jealousy. What really bothered me was how Margaret would compare me to Trevor during fights or moments of misunderstanding, usually in subtle ways that made me feel like I was coming up short. How he was such a good listener when she had problems. It was never direct criticism of me, but it always left me feeling like I wasn't quite measuring up to this perfect friend of hers. There were a few times when Trevor visited that I suspect these two might be up to something. Margaret always had explanations for these moments that made me feel like I was being paranoid or possessive for even speaking about them. She'd say I was reading too much into normal friendship behavior, or that I was being insecure for no reason. After 3 years together, I proposed to Margaret during a weekend trip to the mountains. It was everything I dreamed it would be, perfect. She said yes through happy tears, and we spent the rest of the weekend planning our future. We set the wedding date for 8 months later, giving us time to plan everything we wanted while staying within our budget. Getting engaged was exciting, but also stressful in ways I didn't expect. Margaret threw herself into wedding planning, but she also became more demanding and critical of me. She'd get upset if I didn't show enough enthusiasm for details that seemed minor to me, or if I had different opinions about things she wanted. The wedding planning seemed to bring out more of Margaret's controlling side. She wanted to make all the decisions, but would get angry if I wasn't enthusiastic enough about her choices. It felt like I was supposed to be involved, but only if I agreed with everything she wanted. It was 5 months before our wedding when Trevor called Margaret with news that changed everything. One of their friends from college, a girl named Rachel, who I'd met a few times, was getting married in California. Trevor had been invited and wanted Margaret to come as his date for it. Margaret's excitement about this invitation was intense. She started making plans right away, talking about seeing old friends, exploring California, and celebrating Rachel's wedding. She was practically glowing when she talked about the trip, in a way that made my stomach hurt. What bothered me wasn't just the trip itself, but how Margaret was talking about it. She seemed to be looking forward to this wedding more than our own, and she didn't seem to notice or care how that made me feel. The idea of my fiancé flying across the country to spend a weekend at a wedding with another man felt completely wrong to me. I tried to bring it up carefully, explaining why I was uncomfortable without sounding controlling or unreasonable. I told Margaret that I understood her friendship with Trevor was important, but that traveling together to a wedding felt like crossing a boundary that made me uncomfortable as her future husband. Margaret's reaction was defensive, but also had this edge to it that I'd seen before when she didn't get her way. She said I was being jealous and controlling, that I was trying to micromanage her friendships, and that I was being completely unreasonable about what was obviously just a friendship. She started bringing up examples of times I'd spent time with friends, even though those situations were completely different, and she knew it. She accused me of having double standards and not trusting her, but she wouldn't acknowledge why this particular situation might be different from other friendships. The fight escalated quickly from there. I tried to explain that this wasn't about trust or jealousy, but about respect and appropriate boundaries in our relationship. Margaret got more aggressive, saying that if I really trusted her, this wouldn't be an issue. She also said things that felt designed to hurt me, like how Trevor never made her feel guilty for having friends, or how he was more secure in himself than I was. She was using Trevor as a weapon against me in the argument, which made me realize this wasn't really about the trip at all. We fought for hours that night, going in circles without getting anywhere. Margaret made it clear she was going to the wedding with Trevor, no matter how I felt about it. In the days that followed, Margaret was still determined to go, but now she was also giving me the silent treatment, acting like I was the one who had done something wrong. She'd already asked for time off work, made plans with Trevor about travel, and started shopping for a dress for the wedding. When I tried to bring up the conversation, she brushed me off and said the discussion was over. As the date of her supposed departure drags closer, Margaret's behavior gets even worse. She started making little digs at me, commenting about how some men are secure enough to trust their partners, or how controlling behavior was a red flag in relationships. She also started being more obvious about her conversations with Trevor, taking his calls in front of me and laughing loudly, making sure I could hear her telling him how excited she was about the trip. It felt like she was deliberately trying to make me jealous and upset, and when I'd react, she'd act like I was being crazy and possessive. The week before Margaret was supposed to leave for California, I tried one more time to talk about it rationally. I sat her down and tried to calmly explain why the trip bothered me so much. Margaret listened to everything I said with this bored expression, like she was just waiting for me to finish so she could tell me why I was wrong. Her response was the same as before, but this time she added that maybe I needed therapy to deal with my insecurity issues. That conversation ended with me feeling like I was losing my mind. Margaret left for California on a Saturday morning. I refused to drive her to the airport, but she got Trevor to pick her up, which felt like one final slap in the face. I watched from our window as Trevor's car pulled up and saw Margaret practically skip down to meet him. The wedding was on Monday morning. During the weekend, Margaret sent me a few texts with updates about her trip, but they felt cold. She and Trevor had arrived safely, the weather was nice, and they were catching up with old friends. Her messages felt like she was checking a box, rather than actually communicating with her fiancé. I didn't bother to respond. The next morning, being Sunday, I woke up to find out that she had posted something on social media that felt like a knife to my heart. The post was a photo of Margaret dressed up and looking beautiful with a caption that devastated me. Men think they own you, #independent. She likely posted late the previous night, as the post had already gotten dozens of likes and comments from friends. People were sharing their own stories about controlling partners. She had turned our private relationship disagreement into a public statement about my character. I stared at that post for what felt like hours, reading through the comments. But what really got to me was realizing this had probably been her plan all along after I told her not to go to that event with her best friend. The way she'd been escalating our fights, the comments she'd been making about controlling men, the way she'd seemed to enjoy my discomfort about the trip, it all felt calculated now, like she'd been setting up this narrative where she was the victim and I was the villain. Margaret has always wanted to have complete control in our relationship while making me feel guilty for having any boundaries at all. I didn't respond to the post. Instead, I made a decision that surprised even me with how final it felt. I changed my social media status to single, sent messages to close friends and family explaining that the wedding was canceled, and started making phone calls to vendors to cancel our arrangements. The next few hours were a blur of difficult conversations and practical details. I called the venue, the caterer, the photographer, the florist, and the band, explaining that the wedding was off and asking about getting our money back. Some vendors were understanding and were willing to refund our deposits. I also called Margaret's parents out of respect and my own family to explain that the engagement was over. These were some of the hardest conversations I've ever had, trying to explain what happened without going into too much detail about Margaret's behavior. Both sets of parents were shocked and upset, asking if this was something we could work through with counseling or time. While I was making these calls, I also started packing Margaret's stuff. We'd been living together for over 2 years, and she had a lot of things in our apartment. Clothes, books, personal items, and furniture she'd brought when we moved in together. I packed everything carefully into boxes and bags, trying to be respectful even though I was furious about what she'd done. By evening, all of Margaret's belongings were neatly packed and sitting by the front door. Margaret called me that night after seeing my social media status change, or maybe hearing from friends who'd gotten notifications about our wedding cancellation. I didn't answer the phone. She called over and over for the next few hours, leaving voicemails that went from confused to angry to panicked as she realized what had happened. Her first few messages were asking what was wrong, why I'd changed my status. But even in those messages, there was this tone like she couldn't believe I'd actually done something so drastic. Then they got more frantic as she started hearing from friends and family about the wedding cancellation. By her last voicemail, she was crying and begging me to call her back, but there was still this anger, like she was mad that I'd had the nerve to react to her behavior. I didn't call her back. I'd said everything I needed to say through my actions. Margaret had made her choice when she posted that message on social media, turning our private disagreement into public humiliation. I'd made my choice in response, ending our relationship and engagement with the same finality she'd used to dismiss my concerns about her trip. Margaret came home a day after the wedding ended, probably after catching the first flight she could get when she realized what had happened. I was at work when she got to the apartment, but I'd changed the locks. When she tried to use her key and couldn't get in, she started pounding on the door and yelling my name. Margaret was screaming, asking why her key didn't work when she called me. But even in her panic, there was this entitled quality to her voice, like she couldn't believe I'd actually locked her out of what she considered her place, too, even though I had handled the rent alone. I came home that evening to find Margaret sitting on the floor outside our apartment, looking exhausted and furious. When she saw me, she jumped up and immediately went into attack mode. She demanded to know how I could do something so extreme and embarrassing, how I could cancel our wedding without even talking to her first. She said I'd humiliated her in front of everyone we knew, that I'd made her look like a fool. When I asked her about the social media post and how she'd publicly humiliated me first, Margaret rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic about one little post. She claimed it wasn't even about me specifically, that I was being paranoid and self-centered for thinking everything was about me. But then she said that maybe this was for the best, because she was starting to realize that I wasn't the kind of man who could handle being with a strong, independent woman like her. She said Trevor had helped her see that she deserved better than someone who would try to control her friendships. That's when I knew I'd made the right decision. I told Margaret that I'd packed all her stuff carefully and that she needed to find somewhere else to live. I explained that our relationship was over, that I couldn't be with someone who would publicly humiliate me instead of working through our disagreements privately. When I wouldn't change my mind, Margaret called the police. She told them that her fiancé had illegally kicked her out of their shared apartment and changed the locks without proper notice. She was sure the officers would force me to let her back in and reverse what I'd done. Even as she was making the call, she had this satisfied look on her face, like she was finally going to get the upper hand. The police officers who came were professional and patient, listening to both sides and asking questions about our living situation. When they found out that I was the only one on the lease and Margaret's name wasn't on any of the rental paperwork, they explained that I had the legal right to ask her to leave and that this was a personal matter, not a criminal one. Instead of being embarrassed or sad, she got angry at the police officers, demanding to know why they weren't helping her and accusing them of taking my side because I was a man. That scene with police officers handling the end of our relationship was embarrassing, but it also confirmed that I'd made the right decision. Over the next few weeks, Margaret launched what could only be described as a full-scale social media war against me. She posted long, emotional messages about our breakup, painting herself as the victim of an emotionally abusive relationship. She said I'd been controlling and manipulative throughout our time together, that I'd isolated her from friends and family, and that she was finally free from my toxic influence. She was using every manipulation tactic I'd seen her use in smaller ways throughout our relationship, but now she was doing it publicly and to completely destroy my reputation. The most painful part was seeing how Margaret's posts were affecting my reputation, as I am someone who'd emotionally abused his fiancée. I started worrying about how this might hurt my career and my relationships with coworkers and clients. I tried to ignore the social media attacks for as long as I could, hoping Margaret would eventually move on and stop posting about our relationship. I didn't respond to her posts or try to defend myself publicly, thinking that getting involved would only make things worse. But Margaret continued. After a month of constant harassment, I finally reached out to Margaret directly, asking her to stop posting about me and our relationship. I explained that her social media campaign was hurting my professional life and my relationships with friends and family. I asked her to move on and focus on rebuilding her own life instead of continuing to attack me publicly. Margaret's response was exactly what I should have expected, knowing her personality. She posted our private conversation on social media, along with comments about how I was trying to silence her and stop her from speaking her truth about our relationship. She also added new details to her story, claiming that I'd been financially controlling during our relationship and that I'd threatened her when she tried to leave. None of this was true, but Margaret had gotten so good at this narrative that people believed everything she said without question. That was when I decided to take legal action. I'd been patient and understanding for as long as I could, but Margaret's behavior had crossed the line. I talked to a lawyer who specialized in situations like this, explaining what was happening and showing him the evidence of Margaret's social media campaign. My lawyer looked at all of Margaret's posts, screenshots of her messages, and documentation. He said I had a strong case for defamation and cyberbullying, especially because Margaret was making specific false statements about my behavior that were causing real harm to my reputation. Filing the lawsuit wasn't easy. I knew it would make everything so much worse and potentially drag out the painful end of our relationship for months or years. But I also knew Margaret's behavior wasn't going to stop on its own. The legal process started with my lawyer sending Margaret a cease and desist letter, demanding she stop posting about me on social media and remove the false content she'd already published. Margaret's response was predictable. She posted the legal letter on her social media accounts, along with comments about how I was trying to use the legal system to keep controlling her. She also started a new round of posts about how men use lawsuits to intimidate and silence women who try to speak out about abuse. She set up a GoFundMe page for her legal defense and started positioning herself as a victim of the legal system, as well as a me. When Margaret refused to comply with the cease and desist letter, we filed a formal lawsuit against her for defamation, cyberbullying, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit detailed the false statements Margaret had made about me, documented the measurable harm to my reputation, and asked for both money damages and a court order requiring her to stop her social media campaign. Margaret hired a lawyer as well and prepared to fight the lawsuit, apparently believing her version of events would be proven right in court. But as the case progressed, Margaret's confidence started to fade. The discovery process required both sides to provide evidence supporting their claims, and Margaret's lawyer was struggling to find proof of the abusive behavior she'd been claiming publicly. My lawyer collected testimony from friends and coworkers who could speak to my character and document how Margaret's social media campaign had affected my reputation. We also gathered digital evidence of all Margaret's posts and messages, creating a comprehensive timeline that showed her deliberate escalation from private complaints to public harassment. Margaret tried to settle the case several times as it became clear she was likely to lose. She offered to remove her social media posts and issue a public apology in exchange for my dropping the lawsuit. But by this point, the damage to my reputation was significant, and I wanted a formal judgment that would clear my name and send a message that this kind of harassment wouldn't be tolerated. The trial lasted 3 days, during which both sides presented their evidence and arguments. Margaret testified on her own behalf, but even on the stand, her manipulative patterns were obvious. But when my lawyer questioned her about specific claims she'd made, Margaret couldn't provide evidence to support them. She'd claimed I'd been financially controlling, but had to admit I'd never restricted her access to money. She'd claimed I'd isolated her from friends, but had to acknowledge that I'd never prevented her from seeing people. The judge's ruling was immediate. He found that Margaret had indeed engaged in defamation and cyberbullying, making false statements about my character that had caused measurable harm to my reputation. The court ordered Margaret to pay me about $35,000 in damages, representing compensation for the harm to my professional reputation, the emotional distress caused by her harassment campaign, and the legal fees I'd spent defending myself. Margaret was also required to remove all false content from her social media accounts and post a public retraction acknowledging that her previous statements had been false. Margaret's reaction to losing the lawsuit was a final display of her true character. Instead of taking responsibility or showing any remorse, she posted briefly about being silenced by the patriarchy and claimed the legal system was biased against women. Even in defeat, she couldn't acknowledge that her behavior had been wrong. Looking back on this experience now, I can see all the red flags that were there by the time we got serious and moved in. Margaret's need to be the center of attention, her way of making me feel guilty for having boundaries, her habit of using other people as weapons in our arguments. These weren't new behaviors that emerged during our breakup. I learned that love isn't enough if it comes with manipulation and disrespect. Margaret may have cared about me in her own way, but she cared more about having control and getting her way than about treating me like an equal partner. The legal battle was exhausting and expensive, but it was necessary for protecting my future. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled the situation, whether I should have tried harder to work things out with Margaret. My answer is always the same. The person I thought I was in love with back in college was different from who I was living with and getting ready to marry. Standing up for my boundaries wasn't about controlling Margaret or punishing her for having friends. It was about refusing to accept treatment that felt disrespectful and manipulative. I hope Margaret eventually learned something from this experience, even as she paid and made a public apology, though I doubt it. People with her patterns rarely take responsibility for their actions or change their behavior. More likely, she's found new people to manipulate and new ways to avoid dealing with the consequences of her choices. As for me, I'm grateful for the lessons this experience taught me, even though the learning process was more painful than I could have imagined.